Hi, this is Chris Enretti, and over the next 15 minutes I'm going to be showing you how to produce scatterplots in R. And scatterplots are one of the most common data visualizations in the social sciences. They're relevant whenever you've got two variables which are both continuous variables. So a continuous variable might be something like temperature, income, height. Could also be something more abstract, like levels of democracy. Because scatterplots are sort of general, there aren't very many rules on how we do them. The only convention that I want to signal to you is that ordinarily we put the thing that we're explaining, the outcome variable, the dependent variable, well, we put that on the vertical axis, and the thing that we use to explain, our predictor variable, our independent variable, that goes on the horizontal axis. That's the only convention I want to mention to you. As far as the rest of it goes, there are lots of different ways to customize your scatterplots. I'll be showing you a fair few ways in this video. I'm going to be showing you how to build these scatterplots using ggplot, which is a plotting package for R. And I'm going to be assuming some prior knowledge of how R works. So this is a video for students on PR 3000, the dissertation module. And so I'm really going to be assuming that you have some vague recollection of how R works from PR 1000 or PR 2000. I'm certainly not going to be giving you a complete guide to how ggplot works. And so because I'm not doing that, I have dropped some links there which you may want to follow. When we're setting down to do some plotting, the first thing that we need to do is to load some of the packages or libraries that we'll be using. So anytime you open RStudio or R, probably the first thing you're going to be typing is something like this. They're calling the library function for tidyverse. I'm calling library tidyverse rather than library ggplot2, just because the tidyverse package contains ggplot2 and a couple of other useful things. So that is the first line of code that you'll be entering in R. And that line of code, as with all the other lines of code in this video, is set off in this rather fetching typewriter font. Once you've got your libraries loaded, you can start getting your data in. The data that I'm going to be using today is data which gives information on levels of GDP per capita and levels of democracy in countries around the world. That data you can download using this link here. Download that to whatever project folder you have on your computer. Once you've got that downloaded and once you've told RStudio which directory you're working from, you want to read it in using this command. So I've read that data in to the object called dat. And if that worked, then you should be able to see the first few lines of the data set using the head command. You'll be able to see that we've got several different variables in this data frame. We've got a 3-letter code for the country, we've got a country name. We've got this variable here which is giving us information on GDP per capita in 92 and then again in 2017. We've got some other variables as well where we start seeing some realistic features of the data. We've got a second column also recording the name of the country, except this column has a couple of missing entries shown by the use of NA. NA values are also present for year, region, and one of the other key measures, which is this variable here, which is taken from the VDEM project and which measures the degree of liberal democracy in a country on a scale from 0 to 1. That's what the data looks like, but obviously we want to show people something much more interesting than raw data, and so we need to start plotting it. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how I build up that scatter plot, showing the effect of each line of code as we go. So we've got the code over here on the left hand side, and the plot output is going to appear over on the right hand side. So we start by calling the ggplot function, telling it to use the data in dat. We slowly add elements. So we add the plus sign, hit return. We call the AES function. We tell ggplot the thing that we want to put on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, that's the variable called GDP_PC_1992. And we do just the same for the y-axis. And so already we see our axes start to appear and they indicate the range of the data. Once we've done that, we can add the points themselves, the points that make up the scatter in our scatter plot. When we do that, we do get a warning. So ggplot does tell us that we've got some rows in our data where we had missing values. I'm going to leave that warning up there, but ignore it essentially for the rest of the video. So that's the most basic scatter plot that we could have. It doesn't really show very well this trend between GDP and levels of democracy, partly because lots of the values of the data are kind of smooshed over on this left hand side. What we want to do is we want to transform the data by expanding those values, and what we do is we use something called a log scale, which shrinks big values much more than it shrinks small values. And so already we get a much more recognizable scatter plot, which is showing us something of this link between GDP and levels of liberal democracy. Along the way, I've added two slightly nicer axes labels for the x-axis and the y-axis. And I can also add a title, which is giving, in this case, the main conclusion that I want the reader or the viewer to draw from seeing the scatter plot. In this case, that countries which were richer in 1992 have higher levels of democracy now. And just so that my scatter plot is absolutely clear on the sources of data, I'll also add a caption telling people which sources of data I used. Last thing I do is I theme my plot. This is a very minimalistic theme. It's just drawing a box around the plot element. There is all of the code that I've used in one screen without any formatting. I've broken it up so that you can see what each individual element does. I'd normally write it in a slightly more compact form, but it doesn't really matter. And there are lots of ways of achieving the same outcome with different code. What I've shown you is a fairly basic scatter plot, but you can obviously improve on this by changing the scatter plot in different ways. And here I'll talk you through three different options you might want to consider, which are adding a trend line, mapping an additional aesthetic, and using small multiples. So if you want a trend line, we would use very much the same code, and we'd step through that code and it would give us the same results, except that at a certain point we would add this additional element, a smoothing element. And what that gives us is an ordinary least squares regression line of the kind that you might have used in PR 1000 or PR 2000. That line is indicated in blue, and the shaded grey area gives you some estimate of the uncertainty surrounding that line. That is a nice additional way of pulling out the trend that you want your reader to identify in the scatter plot. But it might not be the trend that you want the reader to focus on. You might want to include additional information in that scatter plot, which will allow the reader to kind of pick out some subsidiary patterns in the data. And I'm going to talk about mapping an additional aesthetics. When I talk about aesthetics, I mean anything like the color of the plotted points, the shape of the plotted points, their size, different things like that. And so what I'm going to do in the next plot is map another variable onto color. And so as before, we create the plot, but what we do here is we call that AES function again and tell ggplot the aesthetic of color, we want that to correspond to the region variable in our data. And once we do that and call geom_point, suddenly we see that countries belonging to different regions have points which are plotted in different colors. We do have this problem with some missing values for a region, and so we might have to go back and get rid of those observations. But you can see how we can add that additional element and add something additional to the plot. At the moment, this plot with the legend on the right hand side might be a bit cramped. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to label it. I'm going to tell ggplot I want this discrete color scale and I want to give that the title of region. And I also want to put that legend at the bottom. Give my chart a little more room to breathe on that horizontal axis. Of course, it's not just color that you can use as an additional aesthetic. You might also want to use the size of each country, its population. And so just as before, we include that additional call to AES, except instead of telling ggplot what we want to do with color, we use size instead. And we tell ggplot that we want to map the population variable, the pop variable, onto size. And so all of a sudden, our plotted points have different sizes depending on their levels of population. And we can step through that plot. And we've got some large points here. So presumably this large point here with a low level of democracy is going to be China. This plotted point here is going to be India. The other points we would have to check to find out. But we can add that additional element there, and that might help us if we thought that some of our conclusions were being driven by one or two very small countries or very large countries. Last way of customizing your plot is to use something called small multiples. People also refer to this as faceting your plot in different ways. So I'm going to keep lots of the elements from the previous scatter plot, but what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add this additional command facet_wrap, and I'm going to tell ggplot I want to facet my plot according to region. And so you see now, rather than having a single scatter plot, we have 6 different scatter plots, 5 for each of our regions and 1 for some of the missing values present in the data. If we wanted to, we could add a further element that we've already talked about. We could add that smooth element, and that would enable us to see that the relationship between income in 1992 and levels of democracy now seems to be much stronger for Europe and America than it is for countries in Africa and Asia. So if you do have some data which you think could be plotted using a scatter plot, do just try getting it into R, trying to plot it, see what you can do with it. And once you've got it into R, you can start playing around with labeling, captions, and some of the additional aesthetics. Ask yourself, is there additional information that I can incorporate in that plot? Does that help me communicate the message that I want to communicate, or does it instead make the plot a little bit too busy for comfort? So do have a think about some of the ways that you could plot in R if you've got those 2 continuous variables.